100 people are very stimulating compared to 100 books or 100 grains of sand. I first came across this quote when flipping through the pages of Susan Cain's book, Quiet: The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking. At first glance, the quote surprised me a little. I wasn't used to seeing people being described as stimulating, but in all truthfulness, the statement resonates deeply with the introverted side of myself. I grew up in dance classes when my peers would be throwing their heads back and belting out their favorite songs and cartwheeling in endless circles around the studio, when all I knew about my sixth grade self was that I was perfectly fine with my spot in the back row. What I find interesting is that I wasn't necessarily a shy kid. I just didn't feel the need to join in when so much was already going on. In all truthfulness, it was a little overwhelming for me. So much noise, movement, and conversation to keep track of all at once. And so whenever I got a sort of sensory overload, I would just stand quietly in the back row as my teacher demonstrated the steps. I was perfectly fine like this until I'd happen to make eye contact with someone, and then I'd feel this burning shame and a painful awareness of everything that I felt was wrong with me. I called myself shy, antisocial, and a flood of not-so-nice names for myself. These self-assigned labels followed me into my junior year of high school, in which I participated in 2-hour-long intensive class discussions, which felt, to say the least, a bit overstimulating for what I felt I could handle. Rather than simply acknowledging that I, as a student, might have a particular learning style, I told myself that there was something inherently wrong with me because it felt like everyone around me was thriving in that setting. I think a lot of introverts might relate to this internalized belief that to be outgoing is the prime state of a person, the ideal to be achieved in life. In her book, Cain talks a lot about the extrovert ideal, which is the idea that our society has built up a special preference for or respect for those fun-loving individuals who aren't afraid to put themselves out there. I myself have always subscribed to these notions as well, believing that extroverts simply have better social skills than introverts, and introverts are often alone because they really don't know much better. But Cain's book pushed me to confront these distorted self-perceptions that I held of myself. It also raised my interest in the neurological basis behind why I actually am the way I am. Before I dig deeper, I want to make 2 acknowledgements. First, there is not a universal standard of temperament. If you spend some time in most Eastern countries, you'll quickly find that many people in those cultures might view introversion to be more of an admirable trait, which is almost the opposite of what I am describing for the United States. So I want to point out that the extrovert ideal is largely a westernized concept, and therefore today I'm focusing through the lens of Western culture. Second, there is no such thing as a total introvert or a total extrovert. Personally, I resonate the most in quieter spaces, with essential oil diffusing in the background and quiet music playing. But of course, there are times when I pursue more externally based activities, like the thrill of a party or going on spontaneous adventures with my friends. But I do also like writing, thinking, reflecting, some hallmark characteristics of introverts and their inner world. So, keeping in mind that a spectrum does exist, anytime I mention the words introvert and extrovert, I'm talking about people who feel like they resonate with one side more than the other, to the point where they identify with that side of themselves the most. With all that being said, there is a neurological basis behind where we fall on the introvert-extrovert spectrum. In the study of human diversity, there is so much nature and nurture to be considered. But the component of nature is a particularly beautiful thing. Look at the brain. All of its neurotransmitters and transporters and signaling pathways and endlessly complex biological systems that make us such uniquely crafted individuals. On that note, a lot of us like to think that we have strong personal control over who we are as people. But what complicates this notion is temperament. Temperament is the distinctive patterns of emotion, attention, and behavior in a person. It differs from personality in that it's relatively fixed over a person's life, and is often thought to be the building block upon which sociocultural factors shape our personalities. Our temperaments are not always directly related to our values and personal beliefs that we may hold, yet it affects almost every decision we make. And it's also, of course, designed mostly by the wiring of the brain. Extroversion and introversion fall under this broad category of things that we call temperament. So let's take a look at an example in which temperament shows up in our daily lives. Have you ever found yourself adjusting the volume of your music as you were trying to do some work because the noise level was either too low or too high for your concentration? If so, you've already experienced the principles of the YatesDodson Law, which states that every person has an ideal arousal level, or simply put, the arousal level at which they perform at their best. With the graph shown above me, it appears to be a middle ground of arousal that contributes to the strongest performance level. And then talking about the two different extremes, having too low of an arousal and too high of an arousal contributes to the weakest possible performance. One study that illustrated this concept particularly well was one where introverts and extroverts were asked to choose their volume of music that they wanted to listen to while doing their homework. Introverts consistently chose quieter music, seen here as providing them with their ideal amount of cortical arousal. Extroverts, on the other hand, consistently chose louder music for their ideal amounts of arousal. Most importantly, the ultimate homework performance between groups did not differ. So, when working at their individual ideal cortical arousal levels, introverts and extroverts did equally well. But why is this? We can take a look at German psychologist HansIsaks' pivotal theory of human arousal, which was first coined in 1967. Isaac proposed that what separates introverts and extroverts is the thresholds at which they achieve their ideal arousals. These thresholds are affected by about 150 chemicals in the brain, varying with their neural concentrations and receptor densities, and much more. At the basis of Isaacs' theory is the reticular activating system, or the RAS of the brain, which is a bundle of nerve fibers at the brainstem, which is essentially the control center for human consciousness. Isaac proposed that introverts' RASes are naturally more active than that of extroverts' RASes, meaning that they're more cortically aroused to begin with and process more information per second than an extrovert does. This may explain why introverts are more quickly overstimulated by, let's say, a bustling crowd of people than their extroverted counterparts. And as we can see from the Yerkes-Dodson bell curve, overstimulation leads to a decrease in function. Conversely, the RAS of the extrovert has a lower baseline level of arousal, which means that they reach their ideal level much less quickly than the introverts. We tend to adjust to what our bodies are telling us, not even realizing what we are doing, often flippantly saying to our friends, I could really use some alone time right now, or I really need to get out and see people. And also, there's a very important component in our lives that relate to temperament, which is reactivity. So there are 3 different categories that you can break down a person's responsivity to stress, which is discomfort, how quickly we perceive discomfort, dampening, which is our ability to stop ourselves from reacting to discomfort, and of course, reactivity, which is our tendency to repeat arousal to a given stimulus. This idea of reactivity was most famously studied by American psychologist Jerome Gan. He put together a famous experiment in 1989 in testing the reactivities of babies, surveying their reaction to various stimuli, and then testing them again and again throughout development into teenagehood, where they were categorized as either high reactive or low reactive, and inhibited or non-inhibited. So those babies who reacted the most strongly to the original stimuli in the experiment actually grew up to be the more quiet and more reserved teenagers. They were then classified as part of the inhibited group. The babies that had originally shown little to no reaction to the stimuli grew up to be part of the uninhibited group. They were more fearless and more unfazed by novelty than their counterparts. At first glance, this finding may seem a bit counterintuitive, as we might think that the more reactive babies, the ones who cried and shouted and flailed their arms in response to things, would grow up to be the extroverts. But with a deeper look, it really does make a lot of sense, especially given established theories such as Isaks of cortical arousal and the RAS. To the babies whose arousal levels were higher to begin with, the loud pops of balloons and the exposure to unfamiliar strangers proved much more disturbing than to those with lower arousal levels to begin with. Now, shifting to a more molecular level, neuroscientists have made some fascinating discoveries about the brain differences in anatomy and physiology of introverts and extroverts. Firstly, understanding the differences in dopamine and acetylcholine dependencies is critical to understanding the groups. Dopamine, which many have likely heard of before, is the classic feel-good and reward-sensitive chemical that is central to the operation of extroverts. As contrary to popular belief, extroverts' brains don't actually produce less dopamine, but their dopamine receptors are much less sensitive, leading extroverts to often pursue activities that will compensate for this decreased sensitivity, such as partying, going on adventures, and other things that we typically associate with extroversion. Meanwhile, for introverts, we are more genetically predisposed to have more sensitive dopamine receptors, which may explain why we are more easily overstimulated. So when things get to be a little too much for the introverted brain, that's when acetylcholine, the chemical that's associated with the calming down of the body, steps in. Interestingly, the neural pathways that the acetylcholine chemical travels through the brain is actually physically longer than the pathway for dopamine. So, in this sense, this is why introverts tend to think before we speak or generally take longer to process external stimuli. It literally takes the introvert longer to process things just because of the different neural pathway lengths. Moving on, there are also very important differences in thickness of and blood flow to the prefrontal cortex, which is involved in higher planning and problem-solving functions in the brain. Introverts tend to have the thicker cortex, as well as the most blood flow to this area, whereas for extroverts, their blood flow tends to place higher on areas that are related to sensory data. This information corresponds strikingly with a generally accepted idea that extroverts are mostly drawn to the outer world, while introverts are drawn to the inner world. And depending on their brain's wiring, extroverts and introverts are also naturally more drawn to different things in the world than others. In one study, published in 2011, a group of researchers set out to explore the relationship between extroversion and social stimuli. The researchers showed subjects pictures of human faces and flowers, and then gauged their responses. For the extroverts, their indicators of human attention scored the most highly when it came to the human faces. For the extroverts, there also wasn't a significant link between their attention and the flowers. For the introverts, however, their indicators of attention placed equally well on both flowers and faces, highlighting a sort of indifference and supporting the idea that when it comes to motivation and human faces, introverts are a little bit more neutral. And to propose the reasons for this phenomenon, we can draw upon the ideas of default arousal levels, as well as dopamine and acetylcholine dependencies. Okay, let's zoom out a little. Why does it matter? Why should we care that our brains are built differently? Statistically, the United States is one of the most extroverted nations in the world. And so in a way, the introverts in our society feel like they almost have to prove themselves as being able to get out of their shell, whatever that means, and just become more extroverted in general. And while I'm not saying that having skills like effortless public speaking and things like that aren't useful to have for selling ideas in the workplace and succeeding in other areas of life, with the current state of our extrovert ideal, so much mutual appreciation between types of people goes untapped. Susan Cain's book and movement of introversion empowerment planted the seeds in me to truly appreciate the things that I can do because I'm an introvert. I've been on a long journey to embrace my temperament that I was largely born with, and the way it affects every aspect of my life, such as my worldview, the way I approach conflict, the relationships I maintain with others, and more. But now, as I turn my attention to the world of neuroscience, I see another world of possibility, one that can take us deeper than we've ever been before. How do we approach societal tradition? How do we approach societal tradition in an increasingly modernized world in which new methods of brain scanning teach us new things about ourselves every day? The extrovert ideal is a product of years and years and years of cultural and historical influences, so it would be difficult to say that it could be overturned easily. But we do need greater public awareness of the science behind introverted and extroverted brains. We should view introverts as having more active RAS systems, as well as lower thresholds for arousal, rather than being less socially adept than extroverts. To assess temperament in this more objective way would bring us worlds away from what we might be used to. The old judgment values that we tend to assign different personality types might then find themselves to be less founded upon practicality. The more we push ourselves to reassess the way our society judges temperament, the more we will be on our way to healthier compromise between people groups. In our current state, a fundamental lack of understanding of the people around us, as well as of ourselves, truly has an impact. Whether it's overlooking an introvert in the workplace or shaming a child for the environments that they are more hardwired to prefer. Assessing temperament through the lens of neuroscience gives us a compelling way to look at someone and say, this person is a person who feels more alive in a certain setting than another setting, rather than a person who fits or does not fit a certain standard. It reminds us that with every experience and every situation brings different stimulation levels, to which our different brains will react differently too. So, let's embrace this beauty of difference. Let's continue to seek out appreciation for the neural complexity that drives who we are and the identities that we construct for ourselves. Introverts, extroverts, and everything in between. Thank you.